You want to go ahead and go?
I think we could probably go ahead. Yep, it looks like most people kind of reached a bit of a threshold here. So yeah, why don't we go ahead and get started? So welcome everyone. Today, as you know, we're going to be talking about food policy with Professor Andrew Stevens from UW-Madison. He sent out two articles that were, I thought, very informative and really provided at least some of the context for today's talk. Argument by Michael Pollan, whom many of us know. He's a very visible kind of author, arguing against concentrated industrial farming. Then the article by Jason Lusk, kind of making an argument that I think very few of us have heard. Maybe I should just speak for myself. A very provocative and very informed article about how industrial farms actually are good for the environment, and they are something that have some virtue to them, and we ought not to just be casting them off arbitrarily. So nice context for today's discussion. And again, thank you to Terry and to Kurt for lining this program up. And I'll turn it over to Terry.
Right, and I just want to add just a couple more things that that Andrew, you said you grew up in Minnesota, so you're a Minnesotan, even though you spent 2 years at University of Mississippi at Starkville after you got your PhD at Berkeley. So we'll want to be hearing some of that accent, not from Mississippi. We want to hear the original Andrew Stevens, Minnesota. One of the things in his CV that Kurt has now posted, you scroll down through the papers, there's a lot of interesting ones, including what we were talking about just as we came on, whether quinoa is a grain, leavened or unleavened. And interesting things that I found were things about soil health, which I'm particularly interested in, because you can get all that good organic food, but it isn't, as the soil's been depleted, does it taste the way it did when I was a kid back in Tennessee? I don't know. Maybe some of the things we can talk about. But thanks so much for doing this. As Dennis says, he's assistant professor at Ag Econ, or Ag and Applied Econ, I guess to be correct, just since 2019. And last year won an award for excellence in teaching. So we're going to test you out on that today and see if you actually deserved it, and we'll go from there. So Andrew, take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Terry, Dennis, Kurt, and everyone here. I am fairly new to Wisconsin, and so had to do a little Googling to figure out what this Plato thing was, and I'm honored to have been asked to participate. So I have prepared just a couple of slides here to get us started, and just to give a sense of how I envision this going. I'm going to sort of set a frame of how to think about food policy as this big issue, maybe spend 15, 20 minutes going through these slides. And I really want to engage on questions and answers and sort of delve into those topics that people in the room today are interested in. I'll dispense with my biography and get into this. Some of the Minnesotan accent will definitely come through, don't you know? So we'll go ahead and dive on in. So when I got asked to talk about this topic, I started by putting together this little figure, and I'm going to put this up at the end of the slides as well as we start talking about the questions and answers. I tried to get my head around what the scope of food policy really looks like. And I had to keep adding bubbles to this. So I tend to think about food policy starting in the field and starting with agricultural production. A lot of people are interested in the environmental impacts of agricultural production, the role of risk, weather risk, price risk, crop insurance. Is that crop insurance subsidized or not? What's going on with commodity prices in international trade, the economies of scale, the specialization of what we might call industrialized farming, which other people would call family farms, and sort of this disagreement over terms. Labor, especially in specialty agriculture out in California, in Florida, in dairy here in Wisconsin, labor is a big issue. And that connects to the broader food supply chain. thinking about the transportation infrastructure. How do you keep cold chain transportation from field to retailer and processors in between? What does the competition and vertical integration there look like? When we get to the retailer, what do we choose to tax or not? How are products labeled, and who regulates the labels? Are the labels communicating information or misinformation? And different people will come down on different sides of that question. Then that sort of connects to, well, who's buying the food? And what does consumer demand for these food products look like? Well, they're driven primarily by consumer preferences, which themselves are changing in response to shifting values and perceptions. They definitely reflect the ability of different people to consume food, and income's a big issue, which itself relates to food insecurity, programs to ameliorate food insecurity, like the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, which ties into big policy questions about public health and the nutrition in our food and what kinds of foods people are eating, what that does for the health of our population, whether that connects with food deserts and the availability of food. And this all sort of in the lower right-hand corner here, talking about bigger pictures, questions about food culture, food justice, food access, who gets to make decisions about what the food system looks like, and sort of the model of how we end up with the system that we're in. So I hope that sounded like a whirlwind, because that's sort of how it feels to me. But I'm going to try and present us a structure to think about these sorts of things, and then return to this at the end and jump into some questions that you all want to focus on. So with that background, I want to just mention sort of what does policy look like in food policy? What kinds of tangible things could we be talking about here that either policymakers, elected officials, or participants in the food system can actually change and affect things? So on the production side of things, on the food supply chain side of things, one big one is the sort of federal commodity program infrastructure. So here I'm thinking about federal crop insurance programs, which are generally subsidized, Title I Farm Bill programs, which if you're into the jargon, these are sort of the main commodity programs, as opposed to like SNAP and the other things in the Farm Bill. Historically, these kinds of policies looked really different. We used to have direct payments, we used to have price supports, and both of those policies have really been replaced for various reasons. Some political, some economic, some good, some bad. So that's a big policy that affects what kinds of foods get grown in our country. Looking at specialty crops, which here you should think about fruits, vegetables, nuts, basically anything that isn't a commodity. A lot of vegetable growers bristle at being called a specialty crop producer, but that's sort of the technical term. In this space, there's a lot of policies that people who just consume these foods don't even know exist. So for a lot of specialty crops, there are either commissions or marketing orders that sort of control information. They allow producers to, depending on the particular structure, collude and keep production down to keep prices up, or to share information about prices so that, so for example, part of my dissertation studied blueberry producers in California, and every blueberry producer in California is mandated to report the sales that they make every day to a central commission, and average data about the prices that people are receiving get communicated out to all the other growers. So there's information sharing there. In dairy, I'm not a specialized dairy economist, but I know enough to know that the economics of dairy are crazy, right? The pricing for dairy is not just like the Chicago Board of Trade for corn. There are geographic constraints, there are marketing orders, and lots of policy there that contributes to the structure of what we see. With labor issues, there's the H2a Visa Program, which is an immigration program that allows workers, especially from Mexico, to migrate seasonally and work primarily in California, Florida, Texas, but throughout the United States. Farm workers generally, the prices that or the wages that they are paid, the sorts of labor protections that they have. Most people in this audience will probably be familiar with the table grape boycott and the Cesar Chavez boycotts of decades past, really putting an emphasis on these labor programs and these labor protections. Then there's all of the environmental impacts that agriculture has. I like to say to people who don't think about agriculture a lot that, agriculture is the single largest way that humanity has affected the landscape of our planet. On a sort of per acre basis, agriculture is a huge influence on what our environment looks like. So at the federal level, we have programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, where the federal government will pay farmers to not grow food on their land and to keep it out of production for 15, 20 years. There's EQIP, which is, I think it's environmental quality something payments, where the federal government will help subsidize farmers adopt certain production practices that are thought to have environmental benefits, like planting hedgerows or adopting cover crops. And then we have sort of this emerging pattern towards carbon markets, where if a farmer agrees to, plant cover crops and till them into the soil, they might be able to sell credits to a carbon market, and something like Delta or American Airlines can buy those credits and offset some of their carbon emissions. So those are all things that I see as food policy. And then this was referenced in some of the readings ahead of time, that market power and competition and just sort of the industrial structure of agricultural production and the food supply chain really raises some questions about competition and prices, and who has the power, and is this a free market or not, and what does that imply for the ability of a individual farmer to earn a profit and make a living or not. And from the consumer side, does that market power and competition lead to higher prices, lower prices, more choice, less choice, too much choice? These are open questions. On the consumption and consumer demand side of things, I have a paper right now that's submitted to a journal looking at food labeling policies. So the thing that paper primarily looks at is non-GMO labeling and mandatory GMO labeling in the state of Vermont, what that does with food demand. Certified organic is a federally defined standard, and you go to the other side of the spectrum and foods can claim that they are natural, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything at all. So food labeling is a big question. Tax policy, similar. Over the last decade, there's been a lot of traction in sugar-sweetened beverages. So famously, Mayor Mike Bloomberg advocated a soda tax in New York City. I was in Berkeley, California, when the city of Berkeley instituted a sugar-sweetened beverage tax. And then just more broadly, many places exempt food from sales tax, which is an interesting question about sort of tax policy. But then what's particularly interesting then is, well, what counts as food? So I have another paper looking at the state of Washington redefined bottled water as not food so that it would be taxed by sales tax. And so we looked at sort of what happened to consumer demand there. And then this is at the end of the list, but I think of all of these, potentially one of, if not the most important, is the federal policy and even state level policies we have to address food security and hunger. So SNAP, the SNAP Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, that is the modern incarnation of what was formerly known as food stamps. It's a very large means tested policy supporting people with low incomes to buy food. WIC is another program you may have heard of. It stands for Women, Infants, and Children. It's similar to SNAP, but very targeted at mothers with young children. And the only products that you can buy with WIC are things related to infants and children. So things like formula, things like milk. And so there are some additional complications in that program. And then in the last year, you may have been noticing that, you know, the federal government, the USDA, did farmer food boxes, which are sort of a different way to think about providing food to people who might be experience food insecurity. And I think just in the last week or two, the USDA announced that they are going to be ending the current incarnation of the farmer food box program. And so different groups responding differently to that news. All right, so I spoke more on those two slides than I was thinking I was going to, so I apologize. I want to introduce these four major themes, talk through them a little bit in the context of the readings that I shared earlier, and then turn to our questions and answers. So the first of the major themes I want to plant is that of incentives. And the main point I want to make is that participants in the food system, all the way from agricultural producers to consumers buying food in the supermarket, we all make predictable decisions in response to the incentives we face. So many of the things that we look at and say, well, why is that? Why is the world the way that it is understandable if you sort of look under the hood at the incentives that people in the system are facing. The second major theme is one of externalities. As an applied economist, I love the word externalities. It's my favorite technical term, I think, possibly in my field. And if you're not familiar with it, we're going to dig into it a little bit. But the main point here is that when producers or consumers don't face the costs or benefits of their actions, there's a classic market failure. So the classic externality, right, is pollution or secondhand smoke, where, you know, the smoker, their internalized cost of smoking a cigarette is whatever they pay for the cigarette, and, you know, the detriment to their own health. But if you're sitting next to the smoker, you don't get compensated for the health costs of being near that secondhand smoke. And so that's a classic externality. There are externalities all over the place in our food system. And that really drives whether a policy is successful or distortionary. And I think it's a really useful lens to use when we're thinking about these things. The third major theme is of this trade-off between efficiency and resilience, especially when it comes to the food system. And that trade-off is real, and it looks really different depending on the perspective you take when you look at it. So I'll dig into some specific examples of that in a second. And then the last major theme, and this I think is really crucial, especially when we're talking about food policy, is that of incidence, which is that the costs and the benefits of different policy decisions, and this is true in all sorts of contexts, but especially in food, those costs and benefits fall on different groups of people. And so from a comparative perspective, there are definitely winners and losers for different policies. And so there are tons of normative questions about who deserves to be a winner and who deserves to be a loser when we're thinking about implementing a new policy. So we'll dig into that as well. So to talk about incentives, all of these quotes that I'm going to put up draw from the readings that have been shared ahead of time. I will read them because I think that's best practice on this virtual teaching. So this is a quote from Michael Pollan. He's a journalist based out in Berkeley, California. Many of you may know his most famous book, which is The Omnivore's Dilemma. He writes, a series of shocks has exposed weak links in our food chain that threaten to leave grocery shelves as patchy and unpredictable as those in the former Soviet bloc. The food system we have is not the result of the free market. No, our food system is the product of agricultural and antitrust policies, political choices that, as has suddenly become plain, stand in urgent need of reform. So I'm going to include several quotes from Michael Pollan, and I should start by saying I think Michael Pollan is extremely useful in this conversation about food policy because he's really good at shining a flashlight on problems. I don't always think that his solutions are capturing sort of the full constellation of perspectives, but I think he's really useful for making us consider what the problems we perceive to be, and thinking through what got us to where we are. So I want to start thinking through here with incentives about his claim that the food system we have is not the result of a free market. And that is absolutely true in the sense that the market for agricultural products and for foods is not a proper free market. There are tons of policies and regulations that affect the way that the system is organized. But what I do want to push back on is that our food system is absolutely responsive to incentives. And private parties, whether those are producers, retailers, consumers, responding to those incentives and the structure emerging in response to those incentives. So in contrast to a planned economy like the Soviet Union, the temporary shortages on grocery shelves about a year ago weren't because someone was inept at planning. It was because certain parts of the supply chain broke down and all of the incentives aligned for those shortages to be addressed. So that's the main point I want to make here, is that what looks like potential failure or lack of concerted effort to design a system actually reflects quite a lot of very rational responses to incentives that people face. So the second theme that I talked about, these externalities, I'm going to start here with a textbook definition. I got this from my favorite environmental economics textbook. An externality exists when one person's actions affect other people who neither receive compensation for harm done nor pay for benefit gained. And so inherent here is the idea that an externality can be positive or negative. So we talked about pollution or secondhand smoke being a negative externality. We might think about, an obese population, because there's so much high fructose corn syrup in our diet, might be a negative externality in the food system. But there are also positive externalities. And all of you who have been vaccinated are part of my favorite example of a positive externality, right? So if I get a COVID vaccine, there is some private benefit in that I'm less likely to get sick myself. But then anyone I live with also gets a secondary benefit because I'm less likely to transmit the disease to them. I don't receive any additional benefit or compensation for the benefit that I'm providing other people. And so that's a positive externality that is not being internalized by the system. When we think about the food system and externalities, there's quite a lot on the environmental side, right? So if you use a lot of nitrogen fertilizer on your farm, famously, we know a lot of those nitrates end up in the water. They flow down the Mississippi. There's a huge hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico where fish die. That's this huge environmental externality that's not internalized in the price of applying fertilizer. Similarly, there are issues about herbicide spread. So if you apply a herbicide and the wind blows it to your neighbor and their plant dies, that's another classic externality that people have to deal with in agriculture. There's groundwater extraction, biodiversity concerns, the list goes on. And then on the consumer side, a lot of this has to do with public health impacts or food insecurity impacts at the societal level that can be directly traced to the food system and the choices that people have to choose from, but that no individual consumer really observes, right? So especially people who rely on publicly subsidized health insurance or the health system funded publicly, that's sort of where this public health externality really manifests. The last point I want to make on this slide is that there's, at least from the economic theoretical perspective, sitting here in the ivory tower, right, there's a really meaningful difference between a policy that aims to internalize an externality, which basically means to take this unpriced cost or benefit and bring it into the market transaction. We see that as correcting a market failure. And that's really different than implementing a policy because we want to achieve a different outcome. All right, so a policy that's trying to put a tax on carbon because there are externalities of CO2 emissions is really different than mandating that 25% of electricity is generated by wind and solar, right? These two things might be trying to address the same general problem, but are really taking different theoretical approaches. And from an economic welfare perspective, we would view them really differently. The third theme that I wanted to talk through is this trade-off between efficiency and resilience. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes here. This one is by Jason Lusk, who's a department head and distinguished professor at Purdue University. He's a well-respected agricultural economist who has done a lot of work on food economics. So he writes, improvements in agricultural technologies and production practices have significantly lowered the use of energy and water and greenhouse gas emissions of food production per unit of output over time. In 1900, about 40% of the United States population was on the farm, and about 60% lived in rural areas. Today, the respective figures are only about 1% and 20%. I wanted to highlight this quote primarily because when we're talking about efficiency or productivity, frequently we talk past each other. Because whenever you're talking about efficiency or productivity, you've got to put something in the denominator. And here in this quote, he's talking about, these the use of energy and water and greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output. So if your denominator is, pounds of food or total calories, that's one way of measuring efficiency and productivity. You could do this per acre. You could do this per farmer. You could do this per calorie of energy input into the system. You will reach different conclusions depending on how you're measuring efficiency and productivity. And that's frequently where I think there's a lot of talking past each other. I don't see this in the public discourse so much anymore, but 5-10 years ago, there was a huge debate over whether organic production practices could feed the world or not. And to me, that was a really red herring argument. If you measure productivity per acre, of course, organic methods can feed the world population. We don't have nearly the number of people to work in agriculture in organic-based systems to generate that amount of food without massive changes to society and sort of the quality of life people are willing to accept. Especially in the United States, if we were to cultivate the area that's currently farmed using organic methods, you would see many, many more people have to return to agriculture. And there's a huge question about who those people are, where they would come from, how much they would be able to earn, and whether they wouldn't just opt out. So all of that is to say, I think we need to be on the same page about what we're talking about and avoid talking past each other when we're trying to disentangle these really tricky issues. Here's another quote about this trade-off between efficiency and resilience. This one's from Michael Pollan again. There will always be a trade-off between efficiency and resilience, not to mention ethics. The food industry opted for the former, and we are now paying the price. Imagine how different the story would be if there were still tens of thousands of chicken and pig farmers bringing their animals to hundreds of regional slaughterhouses. An outbreak at any one of them would barely disturb the system. It certainly wouldn't be for front page news. Meat would probably be more expensive, but the redundancy would render the system more resilient, making breakdowns in the national supply chain unlikely. I think this is a true statement, and I think what's not said on the page, right, is this assumption that that redundancy, that resiliency is worth the increased price or the reduction in efficiency. What I don't see in the public discourse very much is a direct engagement with that social choice. I think people generally come to this discussion with a presupposition about what their values are and that those values should be shared by everyone. And then they, again, talk past each other. I think there are some really interesting questions about how much more expensive meat should be for us to have resilience in the system. And then we would have to grapple with what the implications of that would be. And this is a really good transition into the fourth theme, which is that of incidence. And this quote comes from Craig Gunderson. He's a professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I think his parents actually live here in Madison. And he's a leading scholar, especially about food insecurity. He's testified to the United States Congress about this. He's an expert on the SNAP program. And I'm going to read this quote. More than 35 million Americans lived in food insecure households in 2019. The Biden administration will need to protect the agricultural supply chain so that it can continue to produce affordable food. Of particular note, they need to consider any trade-offs that exist between meeting the environmental goals that we have and food prices. For many Americans, the potential price increases can be borne and are perhaps worth paying for if they lead to improved environmental conditions. But for those who are facing economic hardship, higher prices would lead to more food insecurity. I also think this is a true statement, and I think it makes it really uncomfortable to grapple with two virtuous intentions, right? We want to protect the environment. We want to have a globe for the next generations. And for the 35 million Americans who are in food insecure households, in some sense, there is a direct trade-off between their hunger, their ability to secure the food that they would choose to want to purchase, and environmental quality for a future generation. That's not an economic question, that's a political and moral question, and not really the question that gets engaged with very often when we're talking about these things. And I think this is the last quote I have, and it's related. This was Michael Pollan's quote. "The food chain is buckling, but it's worth pointing out that there are parts of it that are adapting and doing relatively well. Local food systems have proved surprisingly resilient. Small, diversified farmers who supply restaurants have had an easier time finding new markets. The popularity of community-supported agriculture is taking off as people who are cooking at home sign up for weekly boxes of produce from regional growers." What Michael Pollan doesn't write in the piece is that this part of our food system is disproportionately driven by and serving rich white communities. Does not mean it is a bad thing. I have shopped at farmers markets. I have gotten CSAs. I think they are lovely. I think they are good. And they're not the whole picture. And they are not a policy that's going to address the hundreds of millions of food consumers in our country. And so a lot of the public discourse around food policy, I think, sets up red herrings to further a particular objective without engaging in what I think are really challenging, deep questions about trade-offs that we face as a society and how much we want to interfere in the market forces of a food system to achieve certain outcomes. So with that, I'm just gonna plop this figure back up here again and engage with whatever questions that people want to talk about. If we want to talk about, big picture philosophical stuff, that's great. If we want to talk about specific policies or specific research or something more tangible, I'm ready and willing to do that as well. So with that, Terry and Dennis and Kurt, thank you for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So some questions for you. When people buy local foods, what does local mean? In Chicago, for example, the food district, in Chicago School District, which admittedly buys a lot of food, this is all pre-COVID, but they still do it. They considered anything within 250 miles of Chicago buying local food. How do you think about that?
You're exactly right that where you set that cutoff is very arbitrary, and it depends a lot on who's talking about it. I think, when I go shopping at Metcalfe's, I see the local food tags of things up to 100 miles away. I did my undergraduate work in Chicago, and there it was 250, 300 miles for what was local food in my cafeteria. I think, and another thing to mention, right, is that a tomato that you buy in February that was grown in a greenhouse can be local, even if it's not, even if it's a very high energy endeavor to have that hothouse tomato in February. I tend to think, so I'm a consumer who puts a premium on local food, but from a policy perspective, I'm not sure it's the highest thing I would want to focus on. I think it's more than anything else probably a luxury product attribute for people who want to provide additional resources to the local economy. They want to have a personal relationship with their farmer or feel like they're supporting a smaller entity. But there's a book that was written maybe 5-10 years ago, and they called it the locavore's dilemma, sort of in response to Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma.
Right.
They really get into, if what you care about is total carbon emissions, just because it's local doesn't mean it's more efficient or less energy intensive. Flying asparagus from Chile to the United States is very expensive and emits quite a lot of greenhouse gases. But trying to get asparagus in February means probably a lot of greenhouses, may mean a lot of fuel intensive heating, may require a whole lot more trucks to be driving a whole lot more small distances, which aggregated up may or may not outweigh some of the emissions from that plane flying from South America. I don't know how directly I'm addressing your question there.
No.
The short answer is, I don't think local food is a bad thing, but I also don't think that local food is a viable policy at any sort of scale to address deeper issues that people are concerned about.
We have, in the days of when the food producers can tell you exactly what the pressure it takes for your teeth to crack a Dorito, and how you will not get tired of it because you will continue to eat the Dorito or the Lay's potato chips, because they can measure precisely how much energy it takes for you to eat that. So you continue to eat and you continue to eat. What chance do we have against those cravings and those kind of processed kind of foods when when that kind of sophisticated marketing and sophisticated understanding of how we eat and what we taste and my mouth, it doesn't hit that part of the brain that says you're full. I just keep eating it and keep eating it. Is that one of the bigger issues? Is that one that should be better than local?
I think this is a surprisingly philosophical question, right? Which is, at what point does something go from responding to what you value to taking control out of your hands, right? So people who smoke cigarettes, there is enjoyment there. Nicotine is a drug that flashes off receptors in the brain that gives people a positive experience. And then there's an addiction that isn't just, oh, I like that, it's I need that. And so I think there's a really important philosophical distinction in food about like what aspects of our food are addictive beyond just, oh, I like that. I think the food industry doesn't sit in a room and says, how can we use these this high fructose corn syrup and get it into people's mouths despite the fact that they don't like this stuff. They design products that people think taste good and want to consume. And if people are continuing to consume foods that maybe make them sick in the long run, it's unclear to what extent that's an externality. Because, if I make bad health decisions for myself, the main person who has to deal with those decisions is me. It becomes more complicated when I'm addicted to those Doritos now. And maybe you think that people don't have the mental capacity to think long term about what the long run outcomes of their consumer choices are going to be. And the reason I say this is so philosophical is it comes to this question of like, what's the role for public policy in telling people what they should or shouldn't value, or the choices they should or shouldn't make. So this is where I think I think that the policy response to this is very much the sort of thing that during her time as First Lady, Michelle Obama did, which is trying to help form preferences. Trying to convince people that these other healthy foods don't have to taste bad. There are benefits to them. There is a long-term to think about. And there is, we can encourage people to prefer foods that are more wholesome, more nutritious, and things like that.
But doesn't sugar end up being an addiction for a lot of folks? I mean, I think it's as bad as nicotine in terms of what it turns on in people's head, maybe more than salty. I'm a salty guy. My wife's a sugar person. I don't have any much trouble with sugar. With sugar, I can walk away from stuff. She and a lot of people I know can't do that. I can walk away from salt. It doesn't do that to me. But sugar seems to tap one of those things. It seems to me.
Yeah, this is where I'm an academic, right? So I'm like, that's not my area. I don't know. Go talk to a psychologist. But I think putting on the policy glasses, then there are some really interesting questions about, we're in Wisconsin. To what extent should we further regulate beer, which clearly has additional serious negative implications? But it's also culturally very important. People like it. It's, we tried prohibition and it didn't work. Yeah. So is sugar worse than alcohol? Should we treat it differently? And if we do, and I think this is a point that Craig Gunderson makes really well, a lot of these conversations really have classist overtones. Because if you have enough money, well, you're clearly choosing whether you want to eat the sugary diet or not. You can pay for your own healthcare. It's sort of, your own choice to make. We're really talking about policies targeting people who don't have the same choice set. It becomes a very paternalistic conversation. So it's challenging to sort of know what to do.
Yeah, and that same thing happened, of course, in Wisconsin, and maybe when you were gone, but when the legislature was trying to say that you couldn't buy, with your SNAP money, you couldn't buy chips, you couldn't buy certain things. And it became very, very clearly, as you say, an economic class thing about, but first of all, what's available for you if you're only buying it at Walgreens, if that's the only store you've got nearby, what can you actually buy and what's available and what can you afford? And if the chips are cheaper than an orange or an apple or something else, as you talk about preference, all the other stuff available, the legislature tried to get into that, and it really became quite a tussle about what is the instance here of class. If clean fresh water was priced at market prices, how would that impact U.S. food production?
Oh, okay. So I don't know 100% what the person asking that question has in mind, but I have done a little bit of work on water, specifically when I was a grad student out in California. And I'll do my 90-second soapbox about water and agriculture. The economics of water is fascinating, not so much because the economics are complicated or particularly interesting, but because the legal structure of how we handle water in the United States is bizarre. And there are different legal structures for different parts of the country. So sort of from Wisconsin further east, most of the country, where most of the population is under what's known as a Riparian rights doctrine, where if there's water in the stream and you can take some water and leave some water in the stream, you can kind of use however much you want. In the arid West, the legal structure is known as an appropriative rights doctrine, where a particular piece of land has water rights that have seniority. And if you're going to get surface water, it's sort of a tiered system, and some people in a dry year might not get any of their surface water. California, what's the famous quote from the movie? Whiskey's for drinking, water's worth fighting over. And what this has all meant, and people who study, many of our participants today will probably know about groundwater pumping in the Great Plains over the Ogallala Aquifer and in the California Central Valley. Groundwater is really challenging to regulate because it's hard to observe. And it's a classic example of an externality where me as an individual farmer, right, if there are billions and billions of acre feet of water in the aquifer below the ground, no matter how much I pump as an individual person, I make barely a dent. But when everyone on the landscape faces those same incentives, suddenly we're all drawing that water down. And we're overusing the resource for what it can sustain. So the favorite economist answer to this question that was originally asked is, and for those of you who are into all of the details, this would be sort of a Coase theorem solution: turn water into a private good, allocate property rights to water, let people buy and sell it. Suddenly it will become much more efficiently used. There are huge questions about equity and who the winners and losers there are, but it would certainly address a lot of the efficiency questions about use. I think in Wisconsin and this part of the country, water is an issue, but it is not the issue. There are other parts of the world and places like California, places like Kansas and Nebraska, where water is the issue. And we see attempts to try and deal with it, but it's a really challenging collective action problem. In some sense, you can think about trying to deal with water resources, especially groundwater. It's kind of like the global, the climate change, global warming conversation in miniature. It's a public good where it's either impossible or infeasible to allocate property rights, and you're trying to regulate everyone, get everyone to use less of this thing or to emit less, right? So it's a really interesting case study in how to think about those collective action problems. And to whoever asked this question, I have a sense I didn't answer it quite as concretely as you would have liked, so I apologize about that.
I'm not sure if you were around or paid attention as young as you are, but back when Perrier wanted to open a water plant in Wisconsin, there was bumper stickers, "No way, Perrier." And at that point, we found out, of course, that there were something like 1,000 groundwater wells that were not ever regulated before, that were taking out the beer industry, all kinds of things going on. And the DNR had, my understanding as I recall, the DNR, there was no policy about groundwater. So it wasn't just Perrier brought it to the fore, and all of a sudden it was the same issue, particularly when we have our potatoes and what we do with potatoes and what happens with they're near Stevens Point. Since you've talked about your labeling, can you talk about, somebody asked, can you talk about food waste and the dilemma with public health, particularly what's up with expiration dates? I know my daughter, I just got back from Tacoma, and she's out there, and if it has an expiration date on it, they throw it out. And I said, I smell it or look at it or something, but they go by that expiration date. Can you talk about food waste and that type of thing?
Yeah, so let me try and touch on a couple of things. So one is that there's an active debate really in the ivory towers about what food waste is, what we should count as food waste or not food waste. I think my perception of that debate is that food waste is a thing, but it's maybe not the same scale of a problem as some of the other concerns that we have in the food system. There's a big difference in food waste that has been paid for and food waste that is sort of not doesn't face market incentives, right? It's one thing to buy a burger, eat half of it, and throw it away. Maybe then the solution is just you need to provide those burgers in different sizes so that I can actually order what I want. Versus, I don't know, a cafeteria that continues cooking enough food for all of the students at UW, even though we send all of them home for a week because of COVID or something. Those are different things. Expiration dates. This is an area of food policy that I'm not as knowledgeable about, but there's a really interesting tension that I think our policymakers sense between regulations that protect the public, but then also constrain the public, right? So I think most expiration dates are not regulated by the government. They are, added by producers more or less to because consumers want them, or to reduce legal liability if something goes wrong. But from the Ag Marketing Service or the USDA or the FDA, right? If you reduce some of the regulations about food labeling or expiration dates, and then there's an outbreak of salmonella, that's a big problem. And so it's a risk management decision about what the role of the regulation is. I think I'm going to sneak this in here because I think it's fascinating, and I don't know that it would come up otherwise. Food labels are a fascinating area of policy because they really don't always line up with what people think they want. So my favorite example of this is, Jason Lusk, who wrote one of the pieces, we read a quote from him before. I don't know if he's still doing this or not, but for a long part of his career, he ran a monthly food survey of sort of a nationally representative survey about various issues about food, and some questions were repeated, and some months you would pepper in new questions, and it was really informative about what people think about food and how preferences are changing over time. And several years ago, when GMO labeling was a hot topic in state legislatures, all of these sorts of things, he asked a question and found that an overwhelming majority of consumers are in favor of mandatory labels on food that would disclose whether that food contains DNA. Spoiler alert, all food contains DNA unless it's salt, right? But consumers still wanted to mandate that those labels would be on food products because information is a good thing, sort of carte blanche. And in general, I think that's probably true, right? Providing additional information is, all things equal, probably better than withholding information. But there's a reason on this diagram I put misinformation, because there is some evidence that consumers are not necessarily drawing the conclusions from food labels that are accurate or reflective of the nuances that we might expect people to. So yeah, from all of that, I think there are compelling arguments on both sides about sort of what to require from products in the labeling space, but it's not it's not clear to me that those answers are easy.
So what is natural?
You tell me, whatever you want it to be. Yeah, I think so. To my knowledge, the only federally defined standard is USDA certified organic. Basically, all the other labels are either self-disclosed or third party. So things like fair trade or non-GMO project verified, those are all standards, and products, have to jump through hoops to get them, but the government doesn't set those standards. The government doesn't regulate or ensure compliance with those standards. It's a third party. And so I think there's among agricultural producers and food manufacturers, there's a lot of interest in labels. And the key is always, there are 1.2 billion labels out there now, and most of them don't really carry any meaningful value to consumers because there's oversaturation. What does that label mean? Can I trust it? Is it meaningful or not? So I think, and this is where some of you might think that I'm bashing too hard on Michael Pollan, but I'm going to give him some credit here. He has my favorite diet advice ever. I can say, yes, I agree with that. I agree with that in like every possible context. His advice for eating food is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And that is, I can get behind all of that. And I think therefore, the main label that I look at when I'm buying food is the ingredient list, right? And to the extent that I recognize most of the ingredients as plants or animals or food, I think that's the label that makes the most difference to me. And I'm sort of hijacking this question now and talking about, I think this is an older conversation too, but a question about how much should we be pushing organic products as potentially better for people's health, although that's up for debate. I think it's far more important that from a public health perspective, we're moving from eating those potato chips to eating potatoes, rather than from eating conventional potatoes to organic potatoes.
And who is it that says eat only food your grandma would recognize?
I think that's Michael Pollan as well.
That as well, which of course mine would have had a lot of fat in it down in Tennessee because you cooked everything in lard or, the fat was huge, especially with a big family. And so you felt full all the time because you're just eating all that fat. But so here's one, how can we think constructively about Monsanto and its glyphosate resistant seeds and the continued use of it to maintain large yield production of processed carbohydrate foods? It looks like it's somebody trying to think a positive way to understand this. And is there a good thing about it?
Yeah, so just a little bit of background so everyone's on the same page. Glyphosate is the name of the brand name Roundup. It's an herbicide that will kill plants. Monsanto, which I think has now been bought by Bayer and rebranded and all of this, this is an instance of vertical integration where the seed producers will produce genetically modified plants that are resistant to glyphosate. So you plant your corn or your soybeans, they're growing and there's lots of weeds, and you go and you spray the glyphosate, kills the weeds, doesn't kill the plants. The environmental arguments for this is there's much less tilling that you have to do. You don't have to plow the ground to kill all the weeds, and that means there's less erosion, there's less compaction, there's less, you might have healthier soils. There are huge concerns about spread of the glyphosate to other fields. What are the unintended consequences of this? What are the potential for the weeds to adapt and become glyphosate resistant? And then are we using more potent herbicides and all of this? So this is, I think, it's a challenging question. I think I'm in the camp, I eat foods derived from GMOs. I have eaten lots of food that I'm sure was once grown and applied to glyphosate. Glyphosate is on the spectrum of chemicals, not one that I stay up concerned about at night. It's not innocuous, and I would, you want to minimize the use of that to the extent possible. I think as an economist, the big question here is one about market power and concentration and sort of the industrial organization, to use the technical term, sort of collusive power of a company that owns both the herbicide and these herbicide resistant traits in the seeds. So we have seen over the last 100 years, hundreds of regional seed companies that are, developing local varieties of various plants to one handful of major global conglomerates that are still developing a whole lot of different seed varieties for different locations, but are genetically engineering those seeds to be resistant to various things. They're able to extract a lot of economic rents by, selling those seeds at a price that consumers are able to pay, but the highest price that they're able to pay, behaving oligopolistically, monopolistically. And I think that's where, as an economist, I'm most interested in this area. Every once in a while, I'll see news stories about the Justice Department actually thinking about opening up an antitrust case in this area. And it's an area where I think I'm not an industrial organization specialist, but I think those questions are valid, because I think if there were more, if there was more competition in this space, a lot of the concerns that we have about resistance to a particular herbicide or the price-taking behavior of all of these farmers and the lack of choice, which is a real big concern, I think those would be less significant if there weren't so much market power in the seed industry. And I think that was Shirley who asked that question, so I hope that addressed some of that.
Yeah, it brings up that, I'm sure you're probably familiar with that lawsuit that guy down in Illinois lost, that he was just doing his own seeds every year and then got sued by Monsanto because the wind drift got into his. And so, that ended up Monsanto suing him and saying, hey, that's our seeds, that's our stuff. And he lost because he couldn't mount the legal battle to go against Monsanto with something like that. There's an interesting question about the people who cook. I mean, part of this is that, this comes back maybe a class thing, is that people who might want to have good food, but it takes time. You got to know how to follow a recipe. You got to have the pots and pans, and you got to have the time, come back again to the time to chop, to fix. People looking at that in terms of policy?
Yeah, so what I immediately think of are these efforts, I'm thinking like Michelle Obama and normalizing food preparation. And actually someone like Craig Gunderson, who we read an article from, is really good about highlighting that when we think about the food that we actually consume, if we're eating food at home, there is labor involved in food preparation. And if you're not accounting for that in sort of, the shadow cost of one's time during the day, you're missing out on the real cost of food when you buy it at the grocery store and then cook it and eat it, which helps explain why low-income people eat so much fast food. It's not just because they prefer the high-fat, high-salt, high-sugar food. It's also, less expensive on the time dimension. I think a lot of public school systems are exploring integrating curriculum in the school about the lunchroom, producing food, growing food. I mean, this is a huge thing in Berkeley. Alice Waters and Chez Panisse and the public schools there. I mean, everything grows in Berkeley, so it's easy. But I think that's one area where you're seeing more of this. I mean, I took a family and consumer science class. I think 3 decades ago, you would have called it home ec. And, we cooked in school. I don't think it had a huge impact on my life, not nearly as much as growing up in a household with parents who cooked. But I think that's where you develop those skills and those and those norms. There was something else I wanted to talk about cooking at home, but I have, oh, yes. The one other aspect of cooking at home that I think is very interesting and we don't really discuss, I see very little of this in the public discourse, is that much home cooking is good, and it's almost certainly, you know all of the ingredients in what you eat, right? It's all food that goes in, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's terribly healthy. And so, Terry, you and I have spent time in the South. That Mississippi diet was delicious and not super healthy. Now, this comes back to, you know, this lower right-hand bubble about food culture and food justice. I mean, for lots of reasons that are structurally racist in the background of our country, you know, the Southern African American diet is, by the food pyramid, pretty unhealthy. Does that mean that we should be taxing sweet potato pie and collard greens? Because that's really culturally important and culturally appropriate and meaningful and worth something. And so, yeah, focusing on what other people are eating is a really challenging policy conversation to have, because it's not just calories, it's not just macronutrients. It's far more complicated than that.
Yeah. Well, I tell you how my mom could cook the life out of a green bean. You would never know it was still a green bean once you had that big piece of pork in there and let it sit in the black skillet for about 2 hours. It's still green beans, but I'm not sure what nutrition was left in it. Got one here at the conflicting food policy and subsidies promote high calorie, low value foods purchased with federal money, leading, of course, to our obesity and diabetes crisis, which, of course, we saw terrified with the COVID and the people who got it and died. How does the government paternalistically adopt policies benefiting society in the long run? So there's I think you'd say, philosophical question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good one, and it's getting at some of the deeper questions that I think are more meaningful than some of the surface level policy questions. I think generally, my lens is, where are there market failures in the sense of externalities that are not being priced in, or you know, market power that probably isn't justified in any sort of structural way, and digging into that, right? So for me, I look at where are there monopolies or oligopolies that are probably butting up against antitrust issues. So that's one area that I think the government has a unique role to play. You look at the Farm Bill and a lot of our agricultural policy. The policy sphere we have today is far less bad than it was 25 years ago. There were a lot of production policies that really hardwired, perpetuated certain production practices because of how the subsidies were written into law. The policies now primarily, well, I know this is getting recorded, so I'll be a little careful about how I say this all. The main agricultural support program in our country today is subsidized crop insurance. And it is an insurance program, so it manages risk for producers. But in a lot of ways, it is more effective as a support program. It's a politically palatable way to do transfers of funds from taxpayers to farmers through subsidized crop insurance. It's, in a lot of ways, one of its major roles. So there are big questions. It would be easy to do the New Zealand thing, right? New Zealand famously, a couple of decades ago, basically removed agricultural policy. Farmers are sort of really in the wild, wild west. There's no government supports, there aren't price supports. It's pretty free market out there. I don't think that's going to happen in the US. I think people all across rural Wisconsin would say this is going to kill our small rural communities, and I think they'd be right. The agricultural producers of this country are a powerful political group with a lot of valid concerns. So, but to sort of come back to how policy perpetuates things, say you want to grow vegetables or fruits or hemp now that it's legal to grow hemp in Wisconsin, you don't have access to the same programs of subsidized crop insurance as do the corn, soybean, wheat farmers. And there are some good reasons for that, right? It's those programs really require a lot of information about the actuarial risk of these different crops in different areas. And if you're the only blueberry grower in your county of Wisconsin, it's really hard to know how to price that insurance for you. But then there are some bad reasons, which are just that we don't care so much about those small commodities as much because government time is expensive and expertise is missing. So, so to come back to this question about like what's the pragmatic policy, I think I'm very much in favor of attempts to try and shift preferences in sort of this informed way, right? To say, I think we all should want to eat more nutritious food. And when we can, to be willing to pay to eat that more nutritious food. Because we know it's better for our future health, because we know it's probably better for the environment, because it ties us to our cultural heritages and things that we value. And that, yes, I like that Big Mac from McDonald's, it tastes good, it's easy, but I'm going to choose something else over it because I want to. And programs that really help people form those narratives for themselves, I think is not so paternalistic, right? I do think that market forces lead to fairly efficient outcomes, and efficiency is sort of this invisible benefit that we all benefit from. And so, what was it? I don't know if any of you are on social media, but one of the things that's been on my social media a lot recently is some study that was saying, now I'm talking out of turn, but something about how humans always fix a system by adding something new instead of by taking anything away, right? We value complexity for no good reason. And I think food policy might be like that. So rather than fixing something with something new, can we just double down on what we already know and try to create a culture and reflect in our own families, friend groups, and communities, the things that we think will have impact. So this is where I come back to local food or CSA. It's not a bad thing. I participate in it, and part of the reason I participate in those things is I want to send a signal that I value these things, that there is good there, and my purchase is part of a consumer demand that allows these small local producers to be in business. I just don't think that 9 times out of 10, propping that up from a policy perspective is necessarily going to have as efficient an impact or not have unexpected consequences.
Are you worried about how we, I see these things every now and then about we have one type of banana that we eat. We have one type of potato. Where is this seed bank in Iceland or Greenland? Or are you concerned about those types of issues for our food supply?
It's a two-handed answer, yes and no. Those are good examples of how our system is precarious, right? And we have, people have responded to these incentives in a way that has led to quite a lot of efficiency and not a lot of resilience. One way you can handle a lack of resilience is by forcing diversification in the process. We need to diversify the varieties of banana we produce. We're going to use policy mechanisms to sort of force that at the cost of profits or at the cost of higher banana prices, or something like that. Another way that you can address low resilience is through other forms of insurance, right? So with COVID, we have a very efficient, not terribly resilient meatpacking system. And the way that we dealt with a huge shock to the system was a lot of public assistance to the system as it existed to, stay in the black and start up again. This is sort of what we do with agricultural producers, rather than saying to farmers, well, if you go bankrupt this year, or if you're in the red this year, you're going to have to declare bankruptcy and get out of farming. We say it was a really bad year this year. We flood the agricultural sector with relief payments. That happened with the trade dispute with China. And so that resilience is a system resilience that comes from taxpayers instead of by forcing the system itself to be resilient on its own. Those issues, that's, again, philosophical about how you want that resilience to show up. I think when I take the 50,000 foot view and look over 150 years and what agricultural economists have been saying for 3 or 4 generations, the environmental and system risks are real. We will see collapses in my lifetime of parts of that system. And humans are extremely adaptable and resilient. So I think the reason I'm most concerned is for the people with the least ability to adapt, right? Who's the worst off when something bad happens? It's poor people. It's people who are already bad off. We as a culture will be fine. I think the lens that I keep bringing to this, and this makes me sound like Craig Gunderson, is, I'm less concerned about getting the system right as I am about realizing who's at most risk when the system hiccups or fails in part, and making sure that policy is focused on that weak link more than how do we make sure the system is perfect.
What happened in New Zealand?
I have a very good friend who lives in New Zealand, who also works in this space. It has worked well for them because they are a small country. It's sort of like the comparisons of the United States to the Scandinavian countries. There are some lessons to learn, but it's not an apples to apples comparison. A lot of the agriculture in New Zealand is grazing based, so a lot of sheep, a lot of cattle, a lot of dairy, and a lot of those dairy products are exported to East Asia. So it's a much more concentrated agricultural sector, and there are a lot more opportunities for creating value-added products like cheese and dehydrated milk and baby formula than we have for corn growers or soybean growers in the breadbasket of the US. And yeah, so it has worked well for New Zealand, but I think there are limits to the lessons that can be drawn for a country like Brazil or the United States.
Of course, it's Wisconsin, so we have one question on dairy policy. Do you have any suggestions in terms of how we improve and pay attention to that, whether it's from groundwater issues, from the mega farms to simply the nutrition pieces? But you had a dairy policy thought?
I had a student last semester who basically asked me this question, and I think, one of the things I said to him was, for Wisconsin, the answer to this question depends a lot on, how important it is to Wisconsinites that you drive down the road and see dairies of the size we see them. I think the market forces are pushing us towards larger, more consolidated dairy producers. And if that's not what we want, we as taxpayers are going to have to pay for the system we currently have, or smaller dairy farms than where we're going. I'm not Mark Stevenson, who's Mr. Dairy here. He's,
Right. Oh,
in
sure.
my building. So
Yeah.
I'm going to defer to him on most things. But what I do think would be useful, and this is relevant for a lot of other places in the country, agricultural labor is a huge open secret that there's a huge problem across the country. Agricultural producers need labor. By and large, American citizens are unwilling to take those jobs at any wage. There have been good studies to demonstrate this. And so the fact that our immigration system it's not even functioning with paper clips. It's not functioning. That is a huge source of economic and existential stress for industries like Wisconsin dairy. And I think that is one policy area where I think there's a lot of common cause across the political spectrum to try and address that issue.
Yeah, well, it's I know that in Dane County there's been a lot of Russian women, obviously been a lot of Hispanic folks, and but on the issue of keeping the little dairy farms, I think it's in Germany where they literally, as you say, taxpayers pay to have, so as you drive down the road, you see the little red barn, you see the cows in the grass, and it's actually a tourism cost. They classify it under tourism because that's part of who we think we are or what we think people want to see. And so treating that, especially if you think about up in northern Wisconsin, in terms of we want to see the beautiful woods and stuff. Well, if you can't have a mine because it's not good to have a mine, are we willing to pay to keep that so as a tourist cost in a sense, because people want to come up and see those things and look at it that way. And other countries have other ways of approaching this. And I don't know if you have a favorite other country that's doing food policy best. Maybe that'll be our last question. But do you have anyone that is really good?
I also saw that there's Julie has her hand raised, and I want to get to her too.
Go for it.
But just to answer your question really briefly, I don't think that there are any countries similar to the United States that are doing things drastically better. Europe has a very convoluted centralized agricultural policy that reflects really different social values. So whether that's better or worse, it's, food is more expensive in Europe and people pay a lot more in taxes to support the agricultural system that they have. And that's a social choice that they have made. There are efficiency costs, but they're willing to pay them. So it comes back to what's the role of an economist, right? It's to tell you what the pros and the cons are, and then you let someone make the value judgment with that information. So that's sort of where I feel like I keep ending all my answers.
You take Julie's. I don't think I have hers. Go for it. Julie?
Oh, no question. All right.
Okay, great. Well, listen, I'm going to turn it back over to Dennis. Thanks so very much for taking the time. I know this is a tough time this semester for you to have taken this much time, both to prepare and to pull this out, but I sure appreciate it. Dennis?
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. Very thoughtful, very informed. This has been a really great session. And hope everybody has a good lunch. It's lunchtime.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we get together again 2 weeks from today, and that's going to be the first of two-part discussion on gerrymandering. So hope everybody has a good 2 weeks.
Thanks
Take
again,
care.
Andrew.
Yeah,
Bye-bye,
thank you for
everybody.
having me. Good to see everyone.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.